The night I walked across that hotel lobby in Ottawa, I had no idea I was about to lose the most important thing I owned and gain something I didn't know I needed. It was February, the kind of cold that doesn't just bite at you but settles in your chest and stays there. The Château Laurier was hosting the annual Northern Lights Gala, a fundraiser for pediatric burn care at Château, the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. My name is Adrian, and I had been working as a junior logistics coordinator for the event management company hired to run the evening. I was 26 years old, 3 months behind on my portion of the rent in the apartment I shared with 2 other guys in Vanny, and quietly terrified that if I lost this contract, I wouldn't be able to help my mother cover her hydro bills back in Sudbury. I wasn't supposed to be a visible part of the evening. My job was inventory and timing, checking that the silent auction tables were set up correctly, that the caterers had their radio frequencies sorted, that the program ran on schedule. I had a clipboard and a headset and strict instructions from my supervisor, a man named Bruce, who communicated almost exclusively in clipped sentences and disapproving looks. The guests that night were not my world. There were politicians I recognized from the news, tech founders whose names appeared on the sides of buildings, hospital board members who wore their philanthropy like a second skin. They moved through the Château's ballroom easily, the way people do when they've always had access to rooms like that. And then there was Vivienne. I noticed her the moment she came through the entrance on the 2nd floor, not because of anything dramatic, but because of what happened around her. A small ripple, a subtle shift, the kind of unconscious reorganization a crowd does when it doesn't know how to absorb someone. People stepped back just slightly. Eyes moved and then moved away. Conversations didn't stop, but they stuttered. Vivienne Ossie was the only daughter of Raymond Ossie, the founder of Ossie Infrastructure Group, one of the largest civil engineering firms in Ontario. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, and she carried herself with the quiet composure of someone who had learned, through long practice, how not to need the room to acknowledge her. The left side of her face and her left arm bore burn scars, layered, healed, but visible, the kind that tell a story before a person ever speaks. She wasn't hiding them. She wasn't drawing attention to them either. She was just there, present in her own body, in her own skin, and the room didn't know what to do with that. I watched for a few minutes from near the silent auction tables. A group of men who had been laughing loudly near the bar found reasons to face the other direction. A woman who had been approaching from across the room seemed to lose her momentum somewhere in the middle distance and drifted toward the canapés instead. I saw Vivienne register all of it, not with bitterness, not with anger, with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had seen this particular scene play out too many times to be surprised by it anymore. That was what got me. Not pity. Recognition. I grew up in Northern Ontario. My dad left when I was 9, and my mother worked as a PSW at a long-term care facility in Sudbury for 18 years. She had a way of walking into rooms full of people who had been forgotten, people who were old or ill or difficult, and making them feel, even briefly, like they were the most important person she'd ever met. She used to say that the loneliest thing in the world isn't being alone. It's being in a room full of people and feeling invisible. I put my clipboard under my arm and I crossed the lobby. Bruce hissed something at me through my earpiece. I reached up and pulled the earpiece out. Every step across that ballroom floor felt extremely deliberate. I was aware of everything. The sound of the string quartet, the clink of glasses, the weight of the eyes that began to track me as I moved in Vivienne's direction. I was a logistics coordinator in a rented suit. She was the CEO's daughter. The social math was obvious to everyone in that room, including me. I didn't have a line prepared. I didn't have a plan. When I reached her, I just said the first honest thing that came to mind. I told her the smoked salmon canapés near the east wall were significantly better than the ones near the bar, and I asked her if she'd had a chance to try them yet. She looked at me. Just for a moment, she seemed to be calculating something, trying to determine what I wanted. Then something shifted behind her eyes, and she said no, she hadn't, and asked me how I could possibly know that. I told her I'd eaten 4 of them while doing inventory an hour ago. Quality control, I called it. She laughed. It was a small laugh, more surprised than anything, like she hadn't expected to use it tonight. We stood by the silent auction tables and talked. About the canapés first, and then about the gala, and then about the hospital, and then about the particular strangeness of charity events where wealthy people dress up and spend money on each other in order to raise money for people who have none. She was sharp. She noticed things. She had a dry, careful sense of humor that she seemed to deploy only once she'd decided she trusted you. I didn't mention her scars, not because I was trying to avoid them, but because they weren't the point. She was the point. About 40 minutes into the evening, the program moved into a formal portion, a live auction followed by a dance segment, a tradition at Northern Lights apparently going back to the gala's founding in the 90s. The MC asked guests to find partners for a waltz. The string quartet shifted to something slower. I watched the same reorganization happen again, faster this time and more pointed. The men who had been circling nearby were suddenly needed elsewhere. One couple glided past Vivienne without making eye contact. A woman said her was swept off by her husband before the music had properly begun. Vivienne stood with her champagne glass. She was looking at the dance floor. Her expression was controlled and very still, the way a person looks when they have perfected the art of not letting a room see what it's doing to them. I said, "Do you want to dance?" She turned to look at me. This time the calculation was longer. Then she handed her champagne glass to a passing server, and she said, "I should warn you, I'm not especially good at this." I told her neither was I, which was the truth. We stepped onto the floor together. I am not going to romanticize my dancing ability. We were awkward in the beginning, finding our footing, laughing quietly at ourselves. But somewhere in the first minute, the awkwardness settled into something steadier. Her hand in mine was light. She moved carefully, precisely, like someone who had learned to be deliberate with her body in public spaces. Around us, I could feel the room recalibrating. Not warmly, not exactly, more like the adjusting that happens when something unexpected occurs and people don't yet know how to categorize it. I didn't look around. I kept my eyes on her. Near the end of the song, she said something quietly. She said she hadn't danced at a public event in almost 2 years. I asked her why she'd come back tonight. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said her father had asked her to, and she said she hadn't wanted to disappoint him. The music ended. Applause moved through the room, polite, reflexive. But I noticed something shift in the seconds after. 2 women approached Vivienne where we'd stepped off the floor. A man who had been a board member said something to her, brief but direct. The temperature around her had changed. Not because of me. And once you see someone, it becomes harder to look away. I thought that was the whole story. One evening, a good conversation, a slightly awkward waltz, a small shift in the room. I retrieved my earpiece from my jacket pocket. Bruce, to his credit, only gave me a look that suggested I should consider updating my resume. I went home that night to my apartment in Vanier and told my roommate Marcus about it. He said I was either very brave or very bad at reading social situations. I said I wasn't sure there was much difference. 3 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Raymond Ossie. I will be honest, my first thought was a legal one. I stood in our kitchen holding my phone and trying to remember if I'd signed any kind of non-disclosure as part of the event staffing contract. Raymond Ossie had a voice that was calm and deliberate, the kind of voice that suggested he had never once in his adult life felt the need to raise it to be heard. He told me he'd been at the gala. He told me he'd watched what happened. He asked me a very direct question. He asked me if I'd approached his daughter out of pity, out of a desire to impress him, or for some other reason. I thought about it for a second. I told him the truth. I said his daughter had looked like the most interesting person in the room and I had wanted to talk to her, and that I had been raised by a woman who believed that the worst thing you could do to another person was make them feel invisible. There was a pause. Then he said he has a position he wanted to discuss with me. I almost said no. I want to be clear about that. It felt strange, the optics of it being hired by the father of a woman I'd just met. My mother, when I told her, said, "Adrian, don't be an idiot." She used stronger language than that, but I'll leave it there. The position was with the Ossie Family Foundation, which ran community programming in partnership with Château and several other organizations across Eastern Ontario. They needed someone to coordinate outreach events, connecting with burn survivor families, organizing peer support workshops, liaising with schools and community centers. The salary was real. Benefits were real. It was the kind of job I would have spent months applying for on Indeed without ever hearing back. I took it. Vivienne was not part of the reason I said yes. I want to be clear about that too. But she was part of what made the work matter. She was involved with the foundation in a limited way when I started. She came to board meetings, she signed off on things, but she didn't attend events. Hadn't in almost 2 years, not since before the gala. There had been a period, I would learn later, where she had been more visible, media profiles, speaking engagements, public appearances in support of burn care advocacy, and then something had shifted. A story had run in a national magazine with photographs she hadn't approved. The comments had been what you might expect. She'd gone quiet after that, pulled back, stopped going places where people could look at her. I understood that kind of retreat, not from personal experience but from watching my mother's patients, the ones who had been embarrassed or dismissed once too often and had started to build their lives around never being in that position again. It's a rational response. It's also a slow kind of disappearance. My first few months at the foundation were spent mostly behind the scenes. Logistics, coordination, the same kind of work I'd been doing at the event company, but with more consistent hours and a better coffee situation. I started to meet the families in the programs. A father from Kingston whose teenage son had survived a propane explosion at a campsite. A woman from Brockville who had lost significant use of her right hand in a kitchen fire and was relearning how to work as a pastry chef. A 12-year-old girl from Canada named Sophie who had been through 11 surgeries and who told me very seriously that she planned to be a dermatologist when she grew up because she wanted to understand skin better than anyone. I think about Sophie a lot when I try to explain what happened next. Vivienne started appearing in the office more regularly about 4 months after I joined. Not in any dramatic way, she would stop by for meetings, review reports, occasionally eat lunch at the conference table while going through documents. We had conversations that started as professional and drifted into other territory. She had opinions about city planning in Ottawa that were specific and well-researched. She had a podcast she was working on, private for now, about infrastructure and public space. She had a memory for details that occasionally startled me. She would recall something I'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier and ask a follow-up question I hadn't expected. I didn't have a name for what was developing between us for a long time. I don't think I wanted to name it, because naming it meant thinking about the complications. She was the founder's daughter. I was a junior employee. The foundation was the reason I had a job. There's a version of that story that doesn't end well for anyone. What I know is this. One evening in early November, we were the last 2 people left in the office, going over the logistics for a workshop event we were running in partnership with a burn survivors peer support group in Gloucester. It was raining outside, the kind of steady Ottawa November rain that makes you feel like the sky has simply given up. She was reading something on her laptop and I was going through a contact spreadsheet and the room was quiet. She said, without looking up, "I've been thinking about going to the Gloucester workshop." I looked over at her. She said, not to speak, just to be there, in the room. I said I thought that would mean a lot to people. She looked up then. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she was still figuring out how to be in rooms again, that it wasn't that she was afraid of people exactly. It was more that she had become afraid of what she was going to see on their faces when they first looked at her. That split second before a person got their expression under control. I didn't offer her a solution. I didn't tell her it would be fine. I just said that I understood why that was exhausting, and that I thought she'd been carrying it for a long time, and that she didn't have to perform okayness for me. She was quiet for a long moment after that. Then she went back to her laptop, but she came to the Gloucester workshop. She sat in the back. She didn't speak, but she was there in the room for the whole thing. And partway through, Sophie, who had come with her mother and recognized Vivienne from a photo on the foundation's website, walked up to her during the break and asked if she could look at her arm, not in a cruel way, in the frank scientific way of 12-year-olds who want to understand things. Vivienne looked surprised for a second, and then she pushed up her sleeve and let Sophie look. I watched Sophie ask questions and Vivienne answer them, and I watched Vivienne's expression change, the careful stillness giving way to something looser, something that looked almost like relief. After the workshop, in the parking lot while we were loading folding chairs into the foundation's van, Vivienne said, "I forgot that some people just want to understand," I said. "Sophie has that effect on people," she said. "I want to start coming to more of these." And she did, slowly at first, then more regularly, then with a kind of quiet purpose that other staff started to notice. She had a gift, it turned out, for being with people who were struggling, not because she'd been trained in it, but because she had lived in the territory of being looked at wrong, and she knew exactly how to make someone feel that she saw them as a whole person. There were hard stretches. There always are. A profile piece ran in an Ottawa magazine in the spring, well-intentioned, but they used a close-up photograph without fully discussing it with her first, and it circulated on social media with the kind of commentary that makes you want to close every app you own. I found her in the foundation's boardroom that evening, sitting with her phone face down on the table, not crying, not visibly up still. I sat down across from her. She said, "I keep thinking I've gotten past it and then I find out I haven't." I said, "Getting past it isn't linear. My mother's patients used to say the same thing. 2 steps forward, some days it's 1 step back." She said, "Does that ever stop?" I said, "Honestly, I don't know. But I don't think the goal is for it to stop. I think the goal is to get strong enough that the step back doesn't take you all the way back to the beginning." She picked up her phone, looked at it for a second, and put it in her bag. She said, "I keep coming back to that night at the Château. The thing you said about the canapés." I said I stood by my assessment. She smiled. "It was a real one." She said, "You made me laugh before I'd decided to trust you." I think that was the thing. I'd gotten so used to people being careful with me. Careful is its own kind of distance. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The Foundation's annual report that year showed that community engagement had increased by roughly 60%. The peer support programming had expanded into 3 new communities: Pembroke, Cornwall, and Petawawa. A new scholarship fund for families of first responders who had sustained injuries on the job was in development. Those numbers came from a team of people, many of whom had been doing this work for years before I arrived. But Vivienne, being present for it, being a face and a voice and a genuine presence, had changed something in how the organization felt to the people it served. Her first time speaking publicly again was at a breakfast event in the Glebe, in March, in front of maybe 80 people. Donors, community partners, a few journalists. She didn't prepare remarks about her scars. She prepared remarks about the infrastructure of care, what it costs, what it asks of families, what it demands of communities. She spoke for 12 minutes. She was clear and specific and honest. Near the end, she said one thing that wasn't in her notes. She said that she had spent a long time believing that the most frightening thing about being in public was the possibility of being seen, and that she had recently started to understand that being seen was actually the only thing that made any of it worth doing. I was standing at the back of the room. Raymond Ozzie was at a table near the front. I watched him listen to his daughter speak, and I saw something on his face that I didn't feel I had any right to look at for long. After the applause, after the coffee and the handshaking and the folding up of chairs, Vivienne found me near the door. She looked tired in the good way, the way you look after you've done something that cost you something real. She said, "How was that?" I said, "Honest." She said, "Is that good?" I said, "It's the only thing that actually works." We walked out together into the March cold, the kind of Ottawa morning where the sun is out, but the wind still has winter in it, and the snow on the Rideau Canal had gone that particular gray that means it's almost over. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about visibility, about how the goal isn't to get past it but to get strong enough." I said I remembered. She said, "I think I needed someone to walk across the room first. Before I could walk anywhere myself, I didn't know what to say to that." I said the only true thing I had. I told her that she had been the most interesting person in that room since the moment she walked in. That walking across to her had cost me nothing. That the people who hadn't moved, the ones who'd looked away, they were the ones who'd lost something that evening. Not her. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the trees along the street. Then she said, "I won't forget the canapé line. I want you to know that. For the rest of my life, I will remember that as the thing that made me decide to stay in the room that night." I told her I would make a note to always lead with food recommendations in emotionally high-stakes situations. She laughed. The real one again. We kept walking. What I have learned from all of it, from Vivienne, from Sophie, from the families in the programs, from the slow and uneven work of rebuilding something after it's been burned, is that courage is quieter than I expected. It doesn't always arrive as heroism. Sometimes it arrives as staying in the room when you want to leave. Sometimes it arrives as pushing up your sleeve so a 12-year-old can understand your skin. Sometimes it arrives as preparing 12 minutes of honest remarks when it would have been easier to cancel. And sometimes it arrives as walking across a hotel lobby in February because a woman is standing alone, and you were raised by someone who taught you that the worst thing you can do to another person is make them feel invisible. I think about my mother on nights when the work feels large or uncertain. I think about her moving through those long-term care hallways in Sudbury, remembering the names and the preferences, and the stories of people the world had largely stopped paying attention to. She never thought of it as extraordinary. She thought of it as the minimum. I'm still learning what the minimum looks like, but I think it starts with walking across the room.